in the vast, unforgiving stretches of the American West. In the depths of Netflix's most chilling catalog, and in the memories of families still grieving, cold cases are never really cold. They're just waiting to be solved. From unsolved serial killings to terror that rocked a nation, this is more than just true crime. This is truth buried in silence. This is 2025 Cold Case Murders in America. The American West has always been a place of myth and mystery, stretching across barren deserts, towering mountain ranges, and forests so dense they seem to whisper secrets of centuries past. But beneath the awe-inspiring natural beauty lies a haunting truth: countless lives have vanished into these wild lands, never to be seen again. Cold Case Files. Dead West explores those forgotten stories, reopening long-abandoned case files in regions where human crime often goes unnoticed amidst the chaos of nature. With every new episode, viewers are invited into a quiet storm, a place where solitude can quickly turn sinister, and where the line between accident and murder is far thinner than anyone dares to admit. The show doesn't race through its narratives. Instead, it creeps slowly through them. It's forcing the audience to feel the weight of each unsolved murder, each grieving family, and each lead that went nowhere. In one chilling episode, a woman hiking in Montana disappeared, without a trace initially assumed to have been mauled by a grizzly bear. But decades later, a rusted knife found buried under tree roots, along with an anonymous letter, suggested a far more human horror. As investigators re-examined evidence dismissed years earlier, they began to uncover a terrifying possibility. The killer may have returned to the same trail, again and again, hidden behind the mask of the wilderness itself. Critics have noted the show's deliberate pacing, but that slowness is its greatest strength. It allows the stories to breathe, to seep into the viewer's mind like fog settling into a valley. You don't just hear about the crimes, you feel the isolation, the silence, and the still open wounds. Survivors speak in hushed tones, rangers recall signs they once overlooked, and forensic teams revisit scenes long swallowed by nature. Each episode doesn't just pose a question, it reminds us that justice, like the West, can be as elusive as a shadow at dusk. Yet, what makes this series so compelling isn't just the crimes it's the idea that many of these cases were written off too quickly. Nature was blamed, dangers were assumed, and trails went cold. But now, years later, those stories are being reopened, and what they reveal might change how we think about the wilderness and the monsters we imagine live there. As the final scene fades and the camera lingers on a foggy ridgeline, you're left wondering not just who committed the crime, but who else is still out there, hiding behind the silence of the land. And just as the credits roll, the screen cuts to black, promising a deeper dive into another decades-old mystery, this time not buried in trees, but in the rubble of one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in modern history. In the early hours of December 21st, 1988, a quiet Scottish town was rocked by a thunderous explosion that tore through the sky and rained fiery wreckage across the sleepy village of Lockerbie. Moments earlier, Pan Am Flight 103, en route from London to New York, had been cruising at 31,000 feet when a bomb concealed in a cassette player detonated in the cargo hold. In an instant, 270 lives were lost, including 11 residents on the ground. It was, and remains, the deadliest terrorist attack on British soil land yet. Decades later, the true story remains obscured by conflicting evidence, international politics, and a father's relentless search for truth. Lockerbie, A Search for Truth, now streaming on Peacock, is not just a documentary, it's a deeply personal journey into grief, betrayal, and the global consequences of injustice. At the center of this emotional storm is Dr. Jim Swire, a British physician whose 24-year-old daughter Flora was aboard that doomed flight. While most families were left shattered and speechless, Jim refused to let silence win. What begins as a father's grief soon transforms into a decades-long crusade to uncover what really happened that night, and why justice seemed so far out of reach. As the documentary unfolds, we watch Jim confront world leaders, interrogate intelligence failures, and challenge the official narrative that pinned the attack on a single Libyan national, Abdel Basset al-Magra. Colin Firth brings heartbreaking depth to Jim's portrayal, but it's the real interviews, court footage, and personal letters that draw us in. Viewers are shown declassified CIA documents, forgotten diplomatic memos, and courtroom revelations that hint at a cover-up far more complex than anyone imagined. There's growing evidence that other countries, perhaps even powerful allies, knew more than they admitted and possibly allowed the bombing to happen to protect higher interests. The line between victim and investigator begins to blur as Jim's obsession with truth strains his marriage, his career, and his health. Still, he presses on not for vengeance, but to restore dignity to those lost and to hold accountable those who let them fall. The pain etched into Jim's eyes as he visits the overgrown memorial garden, years after the camera stopped rolling, is more powerful than any dramatization. He walks the path of wreckage with a quiet determination, whispering his daughter's name into the wind, as if daring history to answer back. What emerges from this haunting documentary is not just the story of a plane that fell from the sky, but of a father who refused to let the memory of his child be erased by politics and lies. The final moments of the film echo with silence, interrupted only by audio from the original cockpit recorder, layered under Jim's voice as he declares, "The truth doesn't fade, it waits." But just before the screen fades to black, a new voice emerges, a 911 call from a suburban Florida neighborhood, marked by gunfire, chaos, and confusion. A neighbor is dead, the shooter claims self-defense, and the law sides with him. Yet as we dig deeper, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge, one that reveals how legal loopholes can turn deadly, and how the right to protect can so easily become a license to kill. It began like so many American stories, quiet, suburban, and deceptively ordinary. A tree-lined street in Florida, neighbors who waved but rarely spoke. Homes with white fences and trimmed lawns that gave off the illusion of peace. But when the sun dipped behind the palms one summer evening, a single gunshot shattered that illusion forever. The body of a man lay on the driveway, blood pooling into the cracks of the concrete, while another man stood over him holding a handgun, calmly telling police, "He came at me. I had to shoot." What followed wasn't an immediate arrest, or even a thorough interrogation. What followed was a legal justification, stand your ground. The shooter was free to go. The Perfect Neighbor, streaming on Sundance and other platforms, peels back the curtain on what really happened that night. It begins with body cam footage, raw, unflinching, and deeply unsettling. Officers arrive within minutes. The man who fired the shot seems more annoyed than shaken. The victim, a father of two, had been unarmed. Viewers begin to understand what this documentary is truly about, not just a neighborhood feud turned deadly, but how certain laws meant to protect can instead empower those looking for an excuse to kill. Through chilling interviews with local residents, we learn that the shooter had a history of confrontations. He called the police over small disputes. Loud music, kids playing in the street, garbage bins left out too long. He was known as the guy with the cameras, always watching, always ready to file a complaint. But underneath the surface, something darker was brewing, a simmering paranoia, a deep-seated resentment, and an obsession with control. His surveillance cameras caught everything except the moment that mattered most. And when the victim's family begged authorities to look deeper, to treat this not as a justified shooting, but as a murder, they were met with silence. What sets this episode apart is its ability to intertwine law with emotion. Legal experts break down the stand your ground statute, showing how vague language allows for enormous subjectivity. One lawyer describes it as an invisible shield, offering immunity before facts are even established. And in states like Florida, where these laws have become a political battlefield, the system often tilts in favor of the first person to pull the trigger, not the one who ends up in the ground. But the story doesn't stop there. As investigators dig deeper, they uncover unsettling connections. The shooter had online posts filled with coded language, echoing conspiracy theories and racial bias. He had once attended a self-defense seminar where he was told, "It's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6." That same quote, ironically, appears in the case notes of several other stand-your-ground incidents across the country. The victim's wife, her voice trembling with grief, in fury says in the interview he wasn't perfect. He was loud, he had a temper, but he didn't deserve to die for being outside his house. her words linger, haunting and raw, as the screen slowly fades to archival news footage of another case. This time, it's not about neighbors or self-defense. It's about young women forgotten, misjudged, and left in the shadows of a case that would shock the entire nation. Because in the next episode, we journey to the edge of Long Island, where winds howl across empty marshlands and secrets lie buried in the sand. The police had written them off, the world had moved on, but the killer was still out there. And when bones began to resurface in 2010, they uncovered not just a serial killer's trail, but a horrifying question. How many more have we missed? Long Island, New York, a place often associated with wealth, oceanfront mansions, and summer escapes for the well-off. But just beyond the trimmed hedges and glistening beach houses, in the thick reeds of Gilgo Beach, the Atlantic tide carries with it something far darker than sea foam. In 2010, what began as a search for a missing escort named Shannon Gilbert turned into one of the most chilling discoveries in modern American criminal history. Police stumbled upon a set of human remains, but not just hers. Over the following months, more bodies would be found, each one adding to a growing list of unsolved murders, now known as the case of the Long Island serial killer. Gone Girls, the Long Island serial killer, streaming on Netflix, is not simply another true crime series, it's an indictment of systemic apathy. A slow unraveling of how race, profession, and socioeconomic status can influence who gets justice and who becomes another forgotten headline. The victims, many of whom worked in the sex trade, were dismissed by investigators early on. Their disappearances were categorized as lifestyle-related. Their cases shuffled into the cold case cabinet without urgency. But the families never gave up. Now, years later, their voices are finally being heard. The documentary pulls us into the heart of this terrifying saga. It's told not through the lens of the killer, but through the eyes of the victims' mothers, sisters, friends, people who knew them as more than a profession or a police report. One mother recounts how she begged the police to search for her daughter. It's only to be told she'll come back when she needs money. Another describes sleepless nights, calling morgues and hospitals, praying her child was injured rather than dead. The pain is raw, the desperation palpable, and through it all, a sense of betrayal, simmers betrayal, by a system that didn't see these women as worth saving. But the horror doesn't end with the bodies. As the investigation slowly unfolds, we begin to see disturbing patterns. Cell tower pings place calls from the victims' phones after their disappearances, calls that taunt their families, that suggest the killer may have been watching. Some calls are traced to locations alarmingly close to law enforcement offices. Eyewitnesses report seeing strange vehicles parked along the remote stretch of Ocean Parkway in the dead of night. Even more unsettling, several of the remains are found wrapped in burlap, preserved, positioned, and spaced evenly, almost ritualistically, as if someone was curating his crimes for discovery. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the case drags on for years without a suspect. Internal corruption within the Suffolk County Police Department and tensions with the FBI stifle progress. The police chief at the time even blocks federal involvement, later himself being indicted for unrelated crimes. The public begins to wonder, was this incompetence? Or was someone protecting something or someone? As technology advances, new forensic tools breathe life into the investigation. Genetic genealogy, the same method used to catch the Golden State Killer, brings a fresh wave of hope. And in 2023, a breakthrough occurs and arrest is finally made. But even then, questions remain. Is this man the only killer? Why are some of the victims' profiles so different? Are we looking at a lone predator? Or a dumping ground used by multiple men over years, maybe even decades? The documentary leaves viewers in an emotional whirlwind, some closure, yes, but far more uncertainty. And perhaps that's what makes this episode so haunting. The killer thrived in silence, feeding on the indifference of a system that didn't see these women as daughters, sisters, or friends. But now their stories are being told, loudly. And what we VA uncovered is more than a serial killer. It's a reflection of a society willing to look away when the victim's dainty fit the mold. As the episode closes, the camera drifts slowly across the dark waters of the Atlantic. We hear the voice of one of the victim's mothers, barely above a whisper, saying, "She wasn't nobody." She was mine. It's a voice that cuts deeper than any scream. And just when the darkness seems to settle, a new question rises. What happens when the storytellers become the story? When the line between documenting crime and exploiting it blurs so much that we begin to lose sight of what justice really means? In the golden era of primetime television, there was one show that gripped the American imagination like no other. It didn't feature celebrities or political scandal. It showcased something far more disturbing: men caught on hidden cameras, walking into suburban kitchens with bags of condoms, alcohol, and lies. NBC's To Catch a Predator became an overnight phenomenon, airing footage of alleged child predators being confronted by host Chris Hansen before being arrested by law enforcement, waiting just outside the door. Viewers were hooked. The setup was simple. The payoff was explosive. But beneath the surface of viral clips and TV ratings, something deeply uncomfortable was growing: an industry built around humiliation, moral superiority, and ultimately exploitation. Predators, a new meta-documentary streaming on Sundance, dares to ask the question no one wanted to confront. What if the very shows designed to expose evil were themselves perpetuating a different kind of harm? What if the pursuit of justice on screen was hiding a hunger for entertainment, spectacle, and control? The documentary doesn't aim to defend the perpetrators caught in those infamous stings. Instead, it focuses on the people behind the cameras, the producers, the decoys, and the audience that cheered it all on, episode after episode. In its early scenes, Predators presents a behind-the-scenes look at the making of To Catch a Predator. Former staff recall the pressure to deliver increasingly dramatic footage. Ratings demanded more emotion, more confrontation, more breakdowns. What began as an experiment in public safety morphed into a twisted form of reality TV, where shame was the product being sold. And with each season, the tactics became more aggressive. The editing sharper, the traps more theatrical. Law enforcement blurred into show business, and the lines between evidence and entertainment were no longer clear. One chilling interview features a former decoy who describes being praised for luring suspects better than others, like it was a performance on stage. She remembers long hours, last-minute script changes, and a lingering discomfort about the way these men seem undoubtedly dangerous. Others, perhaps just misguided, were paraded on national television before they even saw the inside of a courtroom. In the rush to deliver drama, due process was often an afterthought. And then came the aftermath. One suspect took his own life shortly after being confronted on camera. Another was released after legal errors invalidated the sting. Lawsuits piled up. NBC eventually pulled the plug. But the legacy didn't die, it went online. Spin-offs emerged on YouTube and social media platforms, run by amateur vigilantes with cameras and microphones, eager to create their own viral stings. These new predator hunters rarely worked with law enforcement. Their motives were murky, and their tactics even more dangerous. In some cases, confrontations led to violent altercations. In others, innocent people were misidentified and harassed. The documentary paints a complex portrait of modern justice culture, one where the courtroom is replaced by a comment section, and the presumption of innocence is lost to a clickbait title. Experts warn that the normalization of such spectacles could erode the very foundations of justice. Meanwhile, survivors of abuse express concern that real prevention and protection are being overshadowed by viral content that solves nothing. But perhaps the most haunting element of Predators is how it turns the mirror back on the viewer. Why were we so eager to watch? Why did we treat human tragedy like a cliffhanger? What does it say about a society where shame becomes entertainment, and the hunt for evil becomes its own form of voyeurism? As the documentary winds to a close, the screen goes black. A single statistic appears. Over 100,000 sexual abuse cases go uninvestigated. Every year in the US, most never make the news. Most victims never get justice. And as we scroll, watch, and share, we have to ask, are we really helping, or are we just feeding the machine? But even after these disturbing revelations, there is one thing more chilling than performative justice or systemic failure, and that's silence. Silence in places where it should be loudest. Families who never get answers. Files that sit untouched for decades. People who vanish, never to return, as though they never existed at all. In the next episode, step away from the screens and back into the darkness, into the deepest corners of America's unsolved murders. Because while documentaries ask questions and shows deliver entertainment, real families are still waiting for closure. Real killers are still walking free. And in a world full of noise, the coldest cases are the ones we've forgotten to hear. There's a certain kind of stillness that surrounds a cold case in Erie, oppressive silence that hangs in the air like a storm that never breaks. You can feel it in the eyes of the mothers who never stop searching, in the empty bedrooms that remain untouched for years, and in the boxes of files collecting dust in forgotten corners of police stations. These are not just stories. These are voids gaping holes in lives, communities, and hearts. And perhaps what makes them most terrifying is that in each of these cases, someone out there knows exactly what happened and chose to stay silent. As we continue our journey through America's most haunting cold cases, we begin to uncover an unsettling pattern: cases left unsolved, not because they were unsolvable, but because they were inconvenient. Because they challenged the status quo, implicated the powerful, or simply involved people who didn't seem to matter to the system. These are the kinds of cases that don't get headlines, that don't have documentaries made about them until now. In small towns scattered across the Midwest and the South, you'll find them murders that shocked entire communities, only to be quietly forgotten. In one such case, a teenage girl named Ashley disappeared, walking home from her shift at a diner. Her bicycle was found near a creek, her name briefly mentioned on the evening news, and then nothing. No suspects, no searches, no public pressure. The town moved on, but her mother never did. Years later, a retired detective haunted by the case he couldn't solve returned to the file, only to find crucial evidence had gone missing. Witness statements had been altered. Leads ignored. When he pushed for answers, he was warned to drop it. In another case, a young black man named Darnell was found dead in the back of a pickup truck behind a warehouse in Mississippi. The official cause? Overdose. But his family knew better. He didn't use drugs. He had just received a scholarship. Surveillance footage was mysteriously erased, and whispers throughout town hinted that a well-known local businessman, whose son had a history of violence, might have been involved. But in a place where power protects itself, the case was quietly buried under bureaucracy and fear. These are not isolated incidents. Across the country, local journalists, podcasters, and citizen sleuths are working tirelessly to resurrect these forgotten stories. Armed with little more than public records and determination, they dig through archives, chase down former suspects, and confront aging witnesses who thought time had erased their guilt. And sometimes, just sometimes, they succeed. A DNA match. A deathbed confession. A buried piece of evidence suddenly unearthed. And in those moments, justice flickers back to life, however briefly. But for every case that breaks through, there are hundreds more that don't. Victims whose names are reduced to file numbers. Families who grow old without answers. Killers who blend back into society, living ordinary lives behind masks of normalcy. What these cases reveal is a terrifying truth. In many places, justice is not just delayed, it's denied. What's most disturbing, perhaps, is how thin the line is between a case that's solved and one that's forgotten. A single phone call, a determined investigator, a piece of evidence overlooked. It's not always about complexity. Sometimes it's about who is willing to fight and who is willing to listen. And far too often, the people with the most to lose are the ones who must scream into the void just to be heard. As the episode closes, we hear from the mother of a missing girl who has spent 15 years writing letters to local police, state investigators, and media outlets. "I don't care if it takes another 15, she says through tears. Someone knows something. Someone always knows something. And it is on that note, that quiet plea echoing into the darkness, that we pivot to our final chapter. A case so complex, so controversial, that even now, years after it first made headlines, the questions surrounding it outnumber the answers. A man convicted of murder, a town divided, evidence missing, timelines inconsistent, and rumors of political interference that go all the way to the top. There are stories that end with arrests, confessions, and justice served. There are stories that offer closure: a body found, a killer convicted, a family finally able to bury their dead with answers instead of questions. But most stories in the world of cold cases don't end that way. They taper off into silence. They grow colder not because they're forgotten, but because remembering them hurts. Because the truth is messy, inconvenient, sometimes even dangerous. And then there are cases like this one. A respected businessman found murdered in his own home, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where violent crime was practically unheard of. At first, police suspected a robbery gone wrong, but something didn't fit. The house was undisturbed. The doors locked from the inside, the safe untouched. Rumors swirled of a secret double-life affair, embezzlement, maybe even ties to organized crime, but none of it ever stuck. Witnesses changed their stories. Surveillance footage vanished. And then, as if by design, the investigation began to crumble. Years passed. A local reporter, obsessed with the inconsistencies, began asking uncomfortable questions. She uncovered that the lead detective had once worked for the victim's rival, so that key evidence had been collected and quietly removed from the official record. She published article after article until one day she stopped. Some say she was pressured. Others say she was threatened. All that remains is a single. It's an unpublished piece found in her computer files after she passed, titled, "What They Don't Want You to Know." This case never made national headlines, didn't inspire a Netflix series or a celebrity podcast, but it mattered, because it represents the kind of story that cold cases so often become, not just about loss, but about power, about who gets justice, and who gets erased. As we close this journey through the cold case files of America, we're left not with a neat ending, but with a challenge. To remember that behind every missing person's report is a mother still setting a place at the table. That behind every unsolved murder is a detective staring at a wall of photos, still searching for the thread that unravels the truth. That justice, delayed or denied, is not the same as justice forgotten. Because cold cases aren't just stories of death. They're stories of lives interrupted, of communities still holding their breath, of questions that haven't stopped echoing through the years. They remind us that history is full of unfinished pages and we all have a role to play in writing what comes next. So if this story moved you, if these voices matter to you, then don't let them fade. Take a moment now to like this video, because every engagement helps these stories reach more people. Leave a comment below. Tell us which case stayed with you, which story made you stop and think. Share this documentary with someone you know who cares about truth, justice, and the voices too often left behind. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you never miss the next case, the next clue, the next family still searching in the dark. Because our work isn't done, there are more stories waiting to be told. Together, we'll keep searching until the silence breaks.